17-year-old Daniel walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd been to courtrooms before, but never like this. Never as the actual lawyer. His old leather briefcase felt heavy in his hand, a gift from his grandmother before she passed away. He wore his best suit, though it was a bit too big for his slim frame, and his dress shoes were polished until they shined. The hallways were bustling with people in expensive suits, carrying stacks of papers and talking in hushed, serious tones. Daniel checked his watch. He was 15 minutes early for the hearing, just like his grandmother had always taught him. Being on time is being late, she used to say. He found courtroom 7B and took a deep breath before walking in. The courtroom was exactly like the ones he'd studied in law books, but somehow more intimidating in person. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and that distinct smell of old books and furniture polish. A few lawyers were already there, setting up their materials at the tables. Daniel walked toward the defendant's table, trying to look confident even though his stomach was doing flips. That's when he heard it, a sharp voice that cut through the quiet murmur of the courtroom. "Excuse me, young man." Daniel looked up to see Judge Whitmore staring down at him from the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and glasses perched on her nose. Her expression made it clear she was not happy to see him there. "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is a court of law, not a high school cafeteria," she said, her tone dripping with annoyance. "If you're here for a class project or some kind of school visit, you need to leave. Court is about to begin." A few of the lawyers nearby started to chuckle quietly. Daniel felt his face getting hot. He'd known this might happen, but experiencing it was different than imagining it. "Your Honor, I'm not here for a school project," Daniel said, standing up straighter. "I'm Daniel Rivera, and I'm representing the defendant in the Henderson estate case." The courtroom went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. She stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what?" she said slowly, taking off her glasses to look at him more closely. "You're claiming to be an attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor. I passed the bar exam last year, and I'm fully licensed to practice law in this state." One of the lawyers at the other table, a man in an expensive-looking three-piece suit, actually laughed out loud. Judge Whitmore held up her hand for silence, but Daniel could see she was fighting to keep from smiling herself. "Son, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't funny," she said. "Where is your supervising attorney? Surely you can't expect me to believe you're here alone." "I am here alone, Your Honor. I'm the only counsel for Mr. Henderson." Judge Whitmore shook her head and turned to the bailiff. "Can you please find this young man's parents or guardian? He clearly wandered into the wrong place." "Your Honor, with all due respect, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Daniel said firmly. He opened his briefcase and pulled out his bar certification, walking up to hand it to the bailiff. "This is my license to practice law. Everything is legitimate." The judge took the document and examined it carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at it for what felt like forever, then looked at Daniel, then back at the paper. Finally, she handed it back to the bailiff with a heavy sigh. "This appears to be legitimate," she said, though her tone suggested she couldn't quite believe it. "But I have to say, in 30 years on the bench, I've never seen anything like this." "How old are you?" 17, Your Honor." 17, she repeated, shaking her head. "And you expect me to believe you can handle a complex estate dispute? This isn't some traffic ticket, young man. We're talking about millions of dollars in property." The opposing lawyer, who Daniel knew was Richard Thompson from one of the biggest law firms in the city, stood up with a smug smile on his face. "Your Honor, if I may," Thompson said smoothly, "while I'm sure this young man is very enthusiastic, perhaps we should consider postponing until Mr. Henderson can secure more appropriate representation. This is highly irregular." Judge Whitmore nodded thoughtfully, and Daniel felt panic rising in his chest. He couldn't let this happen. Mr. Henderson was counting on him. The elderly man had specifically sought Daniel out after hearing about how he'd helped a neighbor win a case against a corrupt landlord. Mr. Henderson didn't have money for fancy lawyers like Thompson. Daniel was his only chance, Your Honor. Daniel spoke up quickly. "Mr. Henderson has every right to choose his own legal representation. I may be young, but I assure you I'm fully qualified and prepared to argue this case." Judge Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed again and waved her hand dismissively. Fine, she said. But I'm watching you very closely, Mr. Rivera. One mistake, one sign that you're in over your head, and I'm stopping this proceeding. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Your Honor. As Daniel walked back to his table, he could feel everyone's eyes on him. Thompson was still smirking, clearly thinking this would be the easiest win of his career. Judge Whitmore looked skeptical and slightly annoyed, as if she was already planning to shut everything down at the first opportunity. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly know just by looking at him, was that Daniel had been preparing for this his entire life. While other kids his age were playing video games and going to parties, Daniel had spent countless hours in his grandmother's law office, absorbing everything she taught him. She'd been a brilliant attorney, a fighter for people who couldn't fight for themselves. When she died 2 years ago, Daniel had thrown himself into his studies even harder, graduating law school early and passing the bar exam with one of the highest scores in the state's history. He had a photographic memory, a gift that let him recall every case law, every statute, every detail from the thousands of hours he'd spent studying. More than that, he had his grandmother's fighting spirit and her absolute belief that justice should be available to everyone, not just those who could afford expensive lawyers. As he sat down and organized his papers, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. They thought he was just some kid playing lawyer. They had no idea what was coming. And before this case was over, Judge Whitmore and Richard Thompson would learn exactly why Mr. Henderson had put his faith in a 17-year-old attorney. The first hour of the hearing was brutal. Every time Daniel tried to speak, Judge Whitmore interrupted him. Every citation he made, she questioned. Every argument he presented, she looked at with obvious doubt. It was like trying to swim upstream while carrying a boulder. Richard Thompson, on the other hand, got treated like royalty. When he spoke, the judge nodded along. When he made objections, she sustained them without hesitation. The difference in treatment was so obvious that even the court reporter looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that the property transfer was obtained through undue influence, Daniel said, holding up a folder of documents. And what makes you qualified to determine undue influence, Mr. Rivera? Judge Whitmore asked, peering at him over her glasses. Have you ever handled an estate case before? This is my first estate case in court, Your Honor, but I've studied extensively. Studied, she interrupted with a slight shake of her head. Mr. Thompson, would you like to respond? Thompson stood up with the casual confidence of someone who'd won 100 cases just like this one. He was tall, probably in his mid-50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Your Honor, the defense's claim of undue influence is baseless, Thompson said smoothly. My client, Riverside Nursing Home, has impeccable records. Mr. Henderson's brother signed those documents of his own free will, with full understanding of what he was doing. That's simply not true, Daniel objected, standing up quickly. I have evidence that Mr. Rivera, Judge Whitmore cut him off sharply. You'll get your turn to present evidence. For now, please sit down and let the adults handle this. The words stung like a slap across the face. Daniel felt his cheeks burning as a few people in the courtroom gallery whispered to each other. Thompson actually smiled, clearly enjoying watching the young lawyer get put in his place. Daniel sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He'd expected skepticism. He'd prepared for people to doubt him. But this felt different. This felt personal. Judge Whitmore wasn't just questioning his experience. She was treating him like he didn't belong there at all. The hearing continued for another painful hour. Thompson filed a motion to dismiss the case entirely, arguing that Daniel's client had no legal standing. Judge Whitmore seemed to seriously consider it, which made Daniel's stomach drop. If she dismissed the case now, Mr. Henderson would lose everything. His family home, the property that had been in his family for 3 generations, would all go to the nursing home corporation. Finally, the judge called for a lunch recess. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock, she announced. Mr. Rivera, I strongly suggest you use this time to consider whether you're really prepared to continue with this case. As people started filing out of the courtroom, Daniel gathered his papers with shaking hands. He felt defeated, frustrated, and angry all at once. He'd worked so hard to get here, and now it felt like none of it mattered. That's when he heard voices in the hallway. He was packing up his briefcase when Judge Whitmore's voice carried through the partially open door. She was talking to her clerk just outside the courtroom. I don't care if he passed the bar exam, the judge was saying. This is exactly what's wrong with the legal system these days. We're letting children play dress-up in courtrooms. That boy has no business representing anyone in a case this serious. He did seem prepared, though, the clerk said hesitantly. His paperwork was all in order and prepared. Judge Whitmore scoffed. He's read some books and memorized some laws. That doesn't make him a real lawyer. I give it another hour before he realizes he's in over his head and asks for a continuance. Daniel stood frozen, listening. The words cut deep, but they also lit something inside him. A fire. His grandmother's face flashed in his mind. She'd heard words like these her whole career. People telling her she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough, that she should give up. But she never did, and neither would he. He grabbed his briefcase and headed straight for the courthouse law library. If Judge Whitmore thought he was just some kid who'd memorized a few laws, he'd show her exactly what he was capable of. For the next hour and a half, Daniel spread out documents across an entire table. He went through every single page of the property transfer, every signature, every clause. He cross-referenced dates, times, and locations. And that's when he found it, something so obvious that he couldn't believe Thompson's fancy law firm had missed it. The timeline didn't add up. According to the documents, Mr. Henderson's brother had signed the property transfer papers at 3:47 in the afternoon on March 15th. Daniel had the notary's stamp right there, with the exact time. But he also had something else. Phone records that showed Mr. Henderson's brother had called a crisis helpline at 3:52 that same afternoon, just 5 minutes after supposedly signing away his property rights. Daniel pulled up the recording request he'd filed weeks ago. The crisis center had provided a transcript of that call, and what it contained was devastating. Mr. Henderson's brother had told the counselor that he'd just been pressured into signing something he didn't understand, that people at the nursing home had rushed him, confused him, and made him feel like he had no choice, but that wasn't all. Daniel dug deeper into the medical records he'd subpoenaed. Mr. Henderson's brother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 3 months before signing those papers. The diagnosis was in his medical file at Riverside Nursing Home. Their own doctors had documented it, which meant they knew he wasn't fully capable of making such major decisions, and they'd pushed him to sign anyway. Daniel's hands moved quickly, organizing everything into a clear, undeniable timeline. He created a visual chart showing the sequence of events: the dementia diagnosis, the sudden pressure to sign, the distressed phone call minutes after signing, the nursing home's failure to disclose any of this to the family. As he worked, other lawyers in the library started noticing what he was doing. One older attorney actually stopped and looked over his shoulder. "That's solid work, kid," the man said quietly. "Really solid." Daniel looked up, surprised. "Thank you, sir." "Don't let them intimidate you in there," the attorney continued. "I've seen plenty of expensive lawyers who couldn't put together a case half as well as what you've got here. You keep fighting." Those words meant more to Daniel than the man probably realized. He checked his watch. It was 1:45, 15 minutes until court resumed. He gathered all his materials, organized them perfectly, and headed back to the courtroom. When he walked in, Thompson was already there, chatting casually with another lawyer like he didn't have a care in the world. Judge Whitmore took her seat and looked at Daniel with an expression that seemed to say she expected him to give up any minute. But when Daniel met her eyes, his gaze was steady and determined. He had the truth on his side. He had the evidence, and he had his grandmother's voice in his head, reminding him that justice wasn't about being the loudest or the most experienced. It was about being right. "Mr. Rivera," Judge Whitmore said, "are you ready to continue, or would you like to request a continuance?" Daniel stood up straight. "I'm ready to proceed, Your Honor. In fact, I'd like to call my first witness." The judge looked surprised, but she nodded. "Very well. Call your witness." The defense calls Linda Patterson, the notary public who witnessed the property transfer documents. As the bailiff went to bring in the witness, Daniel saw Thompson's confident smile flicker just slightly. The real battle was about to begin. Linda Patterson walked into the courtroom looking nervous. She was a woman in her early 40s, wearing a simple blue dress and clutching her purse tightly. As she took the witness stand and was sworn in, Daniel could see her hands trembling slightly. "Ms. Patterson," Daniel began, his voice calm and clear. "You work as a notary public, is that correct?" "Yes, that's right," she answered quietly. And on March 15th of this year, did you notarize a property transfer document at Riverside Nursing Home? I did, yes. Daniel walked over to the evidence table and picked up the documents. Can you tell the court what time you notarized these papers? Linda looked at the documents carefully. According to my stamp, it was 3:47 in the afternoon. 3:47 p.m., Daniel repeated, making sure everyone in the courtroom heard it clearly. And can you describe the circumstances? What was happening when you arrived? Thompson jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, relevance. Before Judge Whitmore could respond, Daniel spoke up. Your Honor, I'm establishing the timeline and circumstances of the signing, which is directly relevant to our claim of undue influence. The judge looked at him for a moment, and Daniel could swear he saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Overruled, she said. The witness may answer. It was the first time she'd ruled in his favor all day. Daniel felt a surge of confidence. Linda continued. Well, when I got there, Mr. Henderson's brother was in a small office with 2 staff members from the nursing home. They seemed to be in a hurry. They told me they just needed me to witness his signature quickly. Did Mr. Henderson's brother seem to understand what he was signing? Objection, Thompson called out. The witness isn't qualified to assess someone's mental state. I'll rephrase, Daniel said smoothly. Ms. Patterson, what was Mr. Henderson's brother's behavior like during the signing? Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. He seemed confused. He kept asking what the papers were for, and the staff kept telling him it was just routine paperwork. He signed, but he didn't look happy about it. Daniel nodded and pulled out another document. Ms. Patterson, in your experience as a notary, when someone signs a major property transfer, are they usually rushed through the process? No, absolutely not. Usually people take their time, read everything carefully. This was unusual. Thank you, Ms. Patterson. Daniel turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence phone records from March 15th. He handed copies to the bailiff, to Thompson, and to the judge. Thompson's face went pale as he read them. These records show, Daniel explained, that at 3:52 p.m. on March 15th, just 5 minutes after signing the property transfer, Mr. Henderson's brother called the county crisis helpline. I have a transcript of that call. Objection. Thompson shot up so fast his chair almost fell over. Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial and… On what grounds? Judge Whitmore asked, and her tone had completely changed. She was sitting forward now, actually interested. The relevance is questionable and… Mr. Thompson, the relevance seems quite clear to me, the judge said, cutting him off. Objection overruled. Mr. Rivera, continue. Daniel couldn't help but notice how different her voice sounded now. The dismissiveness was gone. She was actually listening to him. In this call, Daniel said, reading from the transcript, Mr. Henderson's brother told the crisis counselor, and I quote, "They just made me sign something. I don't know what it was. They kept rushing me and I got confused. I think I signed away my brother's house. I didn't want to. I don't know what to do." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was just staring. Daniel pressed on. Your Honor, I'd also like to enter medical records from Riverside Nursing Home itself. He held up another stack of papers. These records show that 3 months before this signing, their own doctors diagnosed Mr. Henderson's brother with early-stage dementia. Thompson looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He frantically flipped through his own copies of the records, probably realizing his team had somehow missed this crucial information. Judge Whitmore put on her reading glasses and examined the medical records carefully. Her expression grew more serious with each page she read. Let me understand this correctly, Mr. Rivera, she said slowly. You're saying that the nursing home had documentation of dementia, then rushed this man through signing away property worth millions, and he called a crisis line minutes later saying he'd been confused and pressured? That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. The judge looked at Thompson. Counselor, did your client disclose the dementia diagnosis to the family before having Mr. Henderson's brother sign these documents? Thompson stood up, and for the first time all day he didn't look confident. Your Honor, my client maintains that all proper procedures were followed. That's not what I asked, Judge Whitmore said sharply. Did they or did they not disclose the dementia diagnosis? I would need to consult with my client to… That sounds like a no, Mr. Thompson. The judge turned back to Daniel. Continue, Mr. Rivera. Daniel pulled out more evidence, documents he'd been saving. Your Honor, I've also obtained internal emails from Riverside Nursing Home's corporate office. He distributed copies around the courtroom. These emails discuss what they call asset acquisition opportunities with patients who have valuable property. He pointed to specific passages. Here in an email dated January 10th, an administrator writes, "Identify residents with significant real estate holdings. Focus on those with diminished capacity who may be amenable to property transfers." The air in the courtroom felt electric. Judge Whitmore was reading the emails with an expression of barely contained anger. Thompson was frantically whispering with his assistant, clearly trying to figure out how Daniel had gotten these documents. Daniel had one more bombshell to drop. "And finally, Your Honor, I've identified 6 other cases in the past 2 years where Riverside Nursing Home obtained property from elderly residents with documented cognitive decline. All of these transfers happened under similar circumstances. Rushed signings, no family notification, and in each case, the resident either tried to reverse the transfer later or called someone expressing confusion shortly after signing." He placed a chart on the easel showing all 6 cases, with dates, property values, and remarkably similar patterns. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. When she looked at Daniel again, there was something new in her expression. "Respect, Mr. Rivera," she said quietly. "Where did you learn to build a case like this?" "From my grandmother, Your Honor. She was an attorney for 40 years. She taught me that the truth is always in the details, and if you look hard enough, you'll find it." The judge nodded slowly. "She taught you well." She turned to Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to all of this, but I have to say, what I'm seeing here is deeply troubling." Thompson stood up, adjusting his tie nervously. "Your Honor, if we could have a brief recess to review—" "You've had months to review your case, Counselor," Judge Whitmore interrupted. "Mr. Rivera is 17 years old and he found all of this. What exactly has your team been doing?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Thompson had no good answer. Daniel sat down at his table, his heart racing. He'd done it. He'd actually turned the case around. Judge Whitmore was no longer looking at him like he was a child playing dress-up. She was looking at him like he was a real lawyer, because that's exactly what he was. As the hearing continued, Daniel presented witness after witness, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. An accounting expert who showed the nursing home's pattern of targeting wealthy patients, a geriatric specialist who explained how dementia affects decision-making capacity, a former employee who testified about pressure from management to get property transfers signed quickly. With each witness, Thompson's case fell apart a little more. And with each piece of evidence, Judge Whitmore's respect for Daniel seemed to grow. The teenager who'd been mocked that morning was now commanding the courtroom. The trial stretched into its 2nd day, and the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely transformed. When Daniel walked in that morning, people actually nodded at him respectfully. The whispers weren't mocking anymore. They were curious, impressed even. Judge Whitmore was already at the bench reviewing documents. When she saw Daniel, she did something that shocked him. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. It was the kind of nod one professional gives another. Thompson, on the other hand, looked like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His entire team of assistants was frantically going through boxes of documents, clearly trying to do damage control. "Mr. Rivera," Judge Whitmore said as court came to order, "I believe you have more witnesses?" "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a forensic accountant." A woman in her 60s walked to the stand, carrying a laptop in a thick folder. She had an air of absolute competence about her, the kind of person who'd spent decades becoming an expert in her field. Daniel approached her with his notes. "Dr. Okonkwo, can you explain to the court what you discovered when you examined Riverside Nursing Home's financial records?" "Certainly," she said, her voice clear and professional. "Over the past 3 years, Riverside Nursing Home has acquired property from residents worth approximately $18 million. In each case, the resident had some form of cognitive decline documented in their medical files." She pulled up a spreadsheet on a screen for the court to see. "What's particularly interesting is the pattern. The nursing home would identify residents with valuable assets, wait until they showed signs of confusion or memory problems, and then present them with property transfer documents, often within weeks of a dementia or Alzheimer's diagnosis. And is this normal practice in the industry? Daniel asked. Absolutely not, Dr. Okonkwo said firmly. Reputable facilities have strict protocols to protect vulnerable residents. They involve family members, require independent legal counsel, and often refuse to engage in property transactions with cognitively impaired residents at all. What Riverside did was predatory. Thompson tried to object several times, but each objection was weaker than the last. Judge Whitmore overruled every single one, her expression growing darker as she listened to the testimony. Daniel then called his next witness, a former administrator from Riverside Nursing Home named Robert Chen. The man looked uncomfortable as he took the stand, avoiding eye contact with Thompson. Mr. Chen, you worked at Riverside for how long? Daniel asked. 5 years. I left 3 months ago. And why did you leave? Robert took a deep breath. Because I couldn't be part of what they were doing anymore. The corporate office had these targets, these quotas for how much property we needed to acquire each quarter. They called it asset optimization. But what it really meant was finding confused elderly people and getting them to sign over their property. Did you ever raise concerns about this? Multiple times, Robert said, his voice heavy with regret. I went to my supervisor, to HR, to anyone who would listen. They told me it was all legal, that the residents were signing voluntarily. But I saw what really happened. I saw staff members isolating residents from their families, rushing them through signings, telling them it was just routine paperwork when it wasn't. Why are you testifying today? Robert looked directly at the judge. Because what happened to Mr. Henderson's brother happened to too many other people on my watch. I stayed quiet because I needed the job, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I can at least tell the truth now. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Thompson didn't try to cross-examine him aggressively. What could he say? The witness was clearly telling the truth, and everyone in that room knew it. During the lunch recess, something unexpected happened. Judge Whitmore asked to see Daniel in her chambers. He walked in nervously, not sure what to expect. The judge's office was lined with law books and framed certificates. She sat behind her desk and gestured for him to sit down. Mr. Rivera, she began, and then paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I owe you an apology. Daniel blinked in surprise. Your Honor, when you walked into my courtroom yesterday, I took one look at you and decided you weren't capable. I didn't give you a fair chance. I let your age cloud my judgment, and that was wrong. It was unprofessional, and it went against everything I'm supposed to stand for as a judge. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. You want to know something? 30 years ago, I was a young attorney, one of the few women in a courtroom full of men. They treated me exactly the way I treated you. They dismissed me, interrupted me, assumed I didn't know what I was doing. And I swore to myself that if I ever became a judge, I would never do that to anyone else. But you did it anyway, Daniel said quietly. Yes, I did, and that's on me. She looked at him directly. Where did you really learn to practice law like this? I've seen partners at major firms who can't build a case this well. Daniel told her about his grandmother, about how she'd been one of the first attorneys of color in the state, fighting discrimination cases in the 1970s and 80s, how she'd homeschooled him in law from the time he was 10 years old, because she recognized something in him, a mind that could remember every detail, every case, every statute. When she died 2 years ago, I thought about giving up, Daniel admitted. But then I realized the best way to honor her was to keep fighting the fight she would have fought. Mr. Henderson came to me because he couldn't afford lawyers like Thompson. He had nowhere else to turn. That's exactly the kind of person my grandmother would have helped. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. She would be very proud of you. She stood up and extended her hand. You're not just a good lawyer for your age, Mr. Rivera. You're a good lawyer, period. And after watching you these past 2 days, I'm confident saying that. They shook hands and Daniel felt something shift. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about proving that justice shouldn't depend on how old you are, or what you look like, or whether you can afford expensive attorneys. When they returned to the courtroom, Daniel noticed something different in how people looked at him. Word had spread during lunch about his performance. Other lawyers in the gallery were watching with genuine interest now, not amusement. Thompson approached him before court resumed. That was impressive work, he said quietly. I underestimated you. My mistake. Are you going to drop the case? Daniel asked. Thompson shook his head. I have a client to represent. But between you and me, I advised them this morning to settle. What you've uncovered here goes way beyond this one case. They're looking at potential criminal charges. Good, Daniel said simply. They should be. As Judge Whitmore called the court back to order, Daniel felt ready. He had one more day of testimony and then closing arguments. He was going to make sure Mr. Henderson got justice, not just for him, but for all the other elderly people who'd been taken advantage of. His grandmother had always told him that being a lawyer wasn't about winning. It was about standing up for what's right even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Looking around that courtroom, seeing the respect in Judge Whitmore's eyes, feeling the weight of the evidence he'd gathered, Daniel knew he was doing exactly what she'd taught him to do, and tomorrow, he would finish what he started. The final day of trial arrived and the courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the teenage lawyer taking on a major corporation, and people wanted to see how it ended. Daniel arrived early, as always, and found Mr. Henderson already sitting in the gallery. The elderly man gave him a thumbs up and a warm smile that made all the stress worthwhile. Daniel had spent the previous night preparing his closing argument. He'd written it, rewritten it, and practiced it until the words felt natural. His grandmother had taught him that closing arguments weren't just about facts. They were about helping people understand why those facts mattered. Judge Whitmore entered, and everyone stood. When she sat down, she looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Rivera, are you ready to present your closing argument? Yes, Your Honor. Daniel stood up, took a deep breath, and walked to the center of the courtroom. For a moment, he felt the weight of everything. The mockery from that first day. The doubt. The uphill battle. But then he thought about Mr. Henderson, about his grandmother, about all the people who couldn't fight for themselves. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady and clear. This case is about more than property or money. It's about the kind of people we want to be as a society. Do we protect our most vulnerable citizens? Or do we allow corporations to prey on them when they're at their weakest? He walked over to the evidence table. The facts here are undisputed. Riverside Nursing Home knew that Mr. Henderson's brother had dementia. Their own doctors diagnosed it. Their own records documented it. And instead of protecting him, instead of notifying his family, instead of making sure he had independent legal counsel, they rushed him into signing away property worth millions of dollars. Daniel picked up the transcript of the crisis hotline call. 5 minutes after signing, this man called for help. He told a crisis counselor he was confused, that he'd been pressured, that he didn't understand what he'd done. That's not a voluntary transfer. That's exploitation. He could see some people in the gallery nodding. Even Thompson looked resigned, like he knew which way this was going. But it gets worse, Daniel continued. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over 3 years, Riverside acquired $18 million in property from cognitively impaired residents. $18 million. They had quotas. They had targets. They had emails discussing asset acquisition opportunities with vulnerable patients. He turned to face Judge Whitmore directly. The law is clear about undue influence. When someone in a position of power takes advantage of someone who's vulnerable, when they rush them into decisions without proper safeguards, that's exactly what undue influence means. And that's exactly what happened here. Daniel walked back to his table and picked up a photo. It showed Mr. Henderson and his brother as young men, standing in front of the family home. This house has been in the Henderson family for 3 generations. It's where they grew up. It's where they buried their parents. It's not just property. It's their history, their legacy. And Riverside Nursing Home tried to take it away from a confused, frightened old man who didn't understand what he was signing. His voice grew stronger. We entrust nursing homes with our loved ones. We pay them to care for people when they can't care for themselves. That trust is sacred. And Riverside Nursing Home violated that trust in the worst possible way. They didn't just break the law. They broke something more fundamental. They broke faith with every family who trusted them. The courtroom was completely silent. Daniel could see one of the jurors wiping her eyes. Your Honor, I'm asking you to find in favor of Mr. Henderson. Return his family's property. Send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Because if we don't stand up for people like Mr. Henderson's brother, who will? Daniel sat down. His hands were shaking slightly, but he felt good about what he'd said. Thompson's closing argument was professional but hollow. He tried to argue technicalities, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. When he sat down, Judge Whitmore looked at him with something close to pity. "I'll take a 30-minute recess to consider my ruling," the judge announced. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. Daniel sat with Mr. Henderson, who squeezed his shoulder and said, "Whatever happens, son, you did good. Real good." When everyone returned to the courtroom, Judge Whitmore had a thick stack of papers in front of her. She put on her glasses and began to read. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, she said, her voice formal and commanding, "This court finds that the property transfer was obtained through undue influence and is therefore void. The property is to be immediately returned to the Henderson family." Mr. Henderson let out a choked sob of relief. Daniel felt his eyes stinging with tears, but Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm awarding damages for emotional distress in the amount of $500,000 and punitive damages of $4 million to send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated." She looked up from her papers, directly at the Riverside Nursing Home representatives in the gallery. "I'm also ordering all case files to be forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal violations. What I've seen here suggests a pattern of elder abuse that goes far beyond this single case." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Case dismissed in favor of the defendant. People erupted in applause. Mr. Henderson was crying openly, hugging Daniel like he was family. Other lawyers came over to shake Daniel's hand and congratulate him. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. Thompson approached and extended his hand. "You're going to have a remarkable career, kid. My firm could use someone like you." Daniel shook his hand politely. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, but I'm going to follow my grandmother's path, helping people who need it most." After the courtroom cleared, Judge Whitmore called Daniel to the bench one last time. "Mr. Rivera, I want you to have this." She handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation, written in her own hand. "I don't usually do this," she said, "but you've reminded me of something important. You reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, to make sure everyone gets a fair shake, regardless of who they are or what they look like." She paused. "I'm going to be more mindful of my biases from now on." "That's a promise." "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot." 6 months later, Daniel opened the Elena Chen Legal Clinic, named after his grandmother. It was a small office, but it was his. He offered free legal services to elderly people and others who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. Mr. Henderson donated money to help get it started, and word spread quickly. Daniel took on case after case, helping people fight against predatory companies, discrimination, and injustice. Judge Whitmore sometimes referred cases to him, and they developed a mutual respect that went beyond that first difficult trial. On his desk, Daniel kept 2 things. The first was a photo of his grandmother in her law office, smiling proudly. The second was a small plaque with a quote she used to say, "Justice isn't about being the loudest or the richest. It's about being right and never giving up." Daniel never forgot the judge who mocked him that first day. But more importantly, he never forgot that she had the courage to admit she was wrong and to change. That, Daniel thought, was what real justice looked like. Not just winning cases, but helping people become better versions of themselves. And every time a new client walked through his door, someone who couldn't afford help anywhere else, Daniel remembered why he'd become a lawyer in the first place. To carry on his grandmother's legacy. To fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. To make sure that everyone, no matter how young or old or powerless they seemed, had someone in the eye